Thanks everybody for coming. As mentioned, I'm Jared O'Neill. I'm an engineering manager at Shipt. I work on internal tools, and today we're going to talk about microservices and monoliths, or as we call it, there and back again, and we'll talk about that in a second. So on the internal tools team, pretty self-explanatory. What we do is we build the interfaces for our other engineers or business users that they need to supplement or perform, any sort of internal operation. We are a primarily front-end team. We use sort of the industry standard TypeScript, React, GraphQL, but it wasn't that long ago that we were all on this really nice monolithic Ruby on Rails, which I think you could also say is sort of like the go-to for most startups. So when we talk about migrations, at Shipt, we've had a few. And right now, as far as architecture goes, as far as systems and patterns, right, we go between monoliths and microservices, just depending on where you are. And in the internal tooling space in particular, we have moved between monolith to micro front ends and then back to a more monolithic structure, which kind of narratively makes us the hobbits of Shipt. And one thing that we've learned through this process, we'll call it experience instead of hardship, but this process is very lengthy. It took us about 2 years to move off of that initial Rails monolith, and then after that, it took us 567 days to move back to a monolith. So I kind of want to stress the importance of this decision is when you take this on, as you can imagine, working on one project in the background for 567 days across 3 teams, 30 engineers. It's over 100 pages, right? That takes like a pretty considerable amount of your organizational momentum and your inertia. And knowing when to move becomes very important, and knowing what to move to is also a huge part of that. So I'm going to zoom out for a little bit and talk about kind of the big picture, and I'll start zooming in, going through the process on how we moved through our microservices and back into our monolith. And want to start out by putting us all on the same page. I'm using monolith and microservice pretty loosely here, really more conceptually than any sort of hard definition. And if you're not familiar, monolith, right, what is in a name? It's a monolith. It's a more unified structure. Your application experience is going to be consolidated into one place, more tightly coupled versus a microservice, which is going to be more independent. These are distributed systems, and these are hypothetically loosely coupled. And put a nice little table here. To use my corpo slang, I'm not going to drain the whole slide for you because it's pretty easy, I think, to get on the internet and find out what are the technical advantages of a microservice, what are the technical advantages of a monolith. Instead, to use more slang, I want to double-click on this team size column or team size row here. I think it's pretty easy when you're making any sort of engineering decision to think to yourself, right, this is a technical decision. We oftentimes don't think about how technical decisions can become business decisions or organizational decisions. So when you're debating monolith or microservice, the thing to keep in mind is not just your size, because you can be on microservices if you're in this 5 to 50 range. You can be on monoliths if you're over that. Shopify, I think, is one of the big ones. They're still on a Ruby on Rails monolith. So if you're ever using Shopify, you're using that Rails monolith. Amazon has monoliths, right? But what's important to think about when you debate these two things is how is your organizational structure going to be tied into your technical structure? Migrations, architecture, these are still business decisions at the end of the day. So if you don't think you have the organizational structure to support a microservice, right, which is something that really needs subdomain level teams, people that are really committed to a certain cause, then you might be better off just sticking with a monolith regardless of your organization size. Just out of curiosity, how many people here work at a company that's got between 5 and 50 software engineers? Okay, cool. So, sorry. Let's say you've kind of outgrown your monolith and you think you might be ready to move to a microservice. How would you know that, and what would that kind of look like? I think one thing that's important to consider when you're making this decision is being aware of the trends that are happening around you, right? Monoliths, microservices, these are all trends in the same way that Jinko jeans, Crocs, and Bama Bangs were trends when we were coming up, right? And I think microservices have really been popular. We kind of saw the emergence 2014, 2015, but there was also a post-pandemic boom in microservices as the market moved in that direction. I think we're kind of now seeing things scale back down a little bit, but we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It's just important to remember whether you choose to migrate or not, there are certainly downsides of microservices, and there's certainly upsides of microservices as well. So speaking of, the first thing you want to ask yourself when you make this decision to move is, do you really have to, right? If you don't have an outcome in mind, if you don't have an OKR, KPI, what have you, then you're just kind of moving for the sake of moving. And if we use our Hobbit analogy again, right, it's like you're fighting the great dragon of Middle-earth for no other reason than to fight a great dragon, which is super cool, but maybe the value of your life probably isn't worth that. We kind of learned that one the hard way. We found ourselves moving to this microservice because we wanted to mirror really the experience that our backend teams were having, and we found pretty quickly that that wasn't exactly the best way to structure our application. So once you start having these issues of scale, once you start having issues in deployment, those are signs that maybe it is time to move to a microservice. When you're in a monolith and you have loosely coupled tooling, it seems pretty easy to be able to say, these two things shouldn't be impacting each other, but what you'll find as you grow in size is that the tools will start kind of, instead of butting up against each other, they start hitting the edges of your monolith, right? And that's where the friction comes from when you're trying to do the classic, square peg in a round hole. And now you're trying to put two square pegs in the round hole, and it's just not working out for anything. And the last thing is when you start having ownership issues, right? It can be difficult to understand in a monolith, what line of code belongs to which team, which directory are certain teams responsible for, what does your on-call rotation look like? If something breaks on this page and it's your PR, who's actually responsible for fixing that? A lot of these issues can be fixed without migration. But certainly there are some, you can hit a point where you've done all these things, you've done the best you can. Maybe the management of your monolith is too complex, and you do want to make that organizational move more towards microservices. The main thing I want to call out here is that, I said there are trends, and as we seem to be coming out of this microservice trend and moving into more monolithic or modular patterns, tools like NX and Vite can become really helpful in helping manage some of those deployment issues. And regardless of what decision you make, that lack of clear ownership, you're going to have to collaborate with people no matter what you do, right? Some people are really good at that, some people not so good at that. But it's not going to matter if you get your own Kubernetes cluster or your own infrastructure file, right? Putting your name on it isn't going to make you less dependent on other features or products to get the job done. So I'd be remiss if I don't have an academic philosophical lesson tied in here. My degree is actually in English literature, so I do a good bit of reading. And I think Kierkegaard nailed it back in 1840 when he was talking about monoliths and microservices, when he said, do it or don't, you'll regret both. And I kind of want to tie that back into this idea that when you move from one architecture to another, when you make any sort of decision, really, any sort of platform move, you're going to have disadvantages for either side, right? You just want to make sure that that outcome, the KPI, whatever it is that you're taking on or trying to improve, you're actually going to get more value from that than you are experiencing negative performance from that. So let's talk about going back the other direction. This is something that I think you don't hear about quite as often. You do hear a good bit about going from, maybe one monolithic to something that's modular and monolithic, or you hear a lot about the mono to micro, but you don't hear a ton about people either going back or going from microservices to monoliths. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, as microservices as a trend are still pretty young in this big picture, a lot of places just haven't matured or experienced sort of the downside long enough for them to be willing to risk going back or trying something else. Like I said, microservices have been around for a long time, but that post-pandemic boom, I think, we're just now kind of hitting the point where some of these services are maybe becoming too complex. And you're going to see, I think, more people start moving this direction. And the second part, and this is kind of related to that, is once you break these things apart, it's really hard to put them back together. Like our buddy Humpty Dumpty here, and sorry for using like the creepiest photo ever, but I thought this really would be more memorable. This is sort of like a sleep paralysis moment, I think. You're going to start seeing this guy when you wake up in the morning. And when it comes to, here we go. Y'all know this picture, you know this video, right? And when you want to go back to the monolith, this is basically the sign, right? Is the complexity of microservice management outweighs the benefits. If you haven't seen this Krazam video, highly recommended. You just type in microservices, Krazam, give it a watch. We actually have multiple teams at Shipt named after microservices from this video, mine included. And I think the main thing to take away, again, here is just if you don't have to make this decision in the first place, you shouldn't. All that being said, let's say you have kind of thought about it, or maybe you're thinking about it, and you want to know just how can you go back. Like I said, it took 567 days, 30 engineers, 100 pages, 40 repos, down to 4 now, I think. Just how do you go about bringing something like that together, especially when, there's not as many cool YouTube videos out there on this. Like Primogen hasn't done one on this, I don't think, so I guess people don't know how to do it. But luckily, we have done it. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you're trying to pull all the pieces of Humpty Dumpty back together is kind of get the image of what does the outside of the puzzle box look like, right? Because you may not be selecting every single microservice in your organization, right? This is kind of, we're building another application. What is the full scope of this application going to be? Once again, tie that back into metrics and outcomes. If you're, looking again at microservice management and complexity, that most likely manifests itself in the form of platform work, right? So do you know how much time you're spending on maintenance right now, right? How much time are you spending upgrading dependencies and versioning problems and things like that? There are ways to make it faster. You can certainly look into that the same way that there are ways to make your monolith a little more scalable. But when you kind of start experiencing organizational friction around maintaining microservices, this might be a sign that, hey, these are the metrics and outcomes, things like how long does it take you to close a PR, that maybe something more monolithic is in your favor. The best way to do that is to look at your data, data set, roll bar, Datadog, scaler, right? Anything you can do to find errors, any sort of repetitive flows, things like that, where you may be running into outages. That's a great way of looking at your scope and saying like, okay, this is where we need to draw the line because we need to pull this problem in to what it is that we're building. Next step, gather your partners, your other engineering managers, your other tech leads, product managers, these folks, right? You probably have a good idea at the top of your head. Hey, this is my direct peer, this is my direct collaborator. I know that this is the person that I need in the room. But there are other systems that we take for granted, right? Delivery, compliance, InfoSec, cybersecurity, right? All these things, maybe you configure them once, and then you kind of just let them run in the background forever. User authentication, right? Intro, ping, Okta, auth 0. How are you going to manage auth? And this is why it gets so hard organizationally, is that you can have microservices that are built with all sorts of different authentication services within your organization. You can have different tech stacks, things like that. So making sure that you pull everybody in early and have these conversations first before you start kicking this off, and then later realizing like, oh, wait a minute, like we actually need a user's ID or something. We need some sort of token we need to pass to complete this API request. These people typically know more about that than us lowly front-end engineers who are barely doing any engineering, right? The way I kind of look at this is, Arnold could have never defeated the Predator without Carl Weathers' help. If you haven't seen Predator, also highly recommended. Maybe watch that like right after the Krazam video. It's a little bit of whiplash, but you'll get the picture. All right, now it's time to write some code. Good thing and a bad thing. You would kind of hope that this would be like, I'm going to dump all my small buckets into my large bucket and we'll call it a day. It doesn't quite work out that way. There's going to be a non-trivial amount of code that goes into this to get this done. You're going to have all these microservices, like I just said, that have these different settings, so to speak, and you're going to want to adopt and configure that into the next generation of your application. While you're in there, you may be tempted, right? You're like, oh, I'm just going to write a little bit of auth, so like maybe I'll go ahead and just rewrite this whole page, and maybe we'll put that in the repo. Don't do that if you can help it. I know some people can't resist the allure of rewrites, but what you're going to find is more often than not, things are just going to catch on fire, and then that's going to be even more time. Like I said, 2 years for the first migration, a year and a half for the second. That's a lot of time to sink in. You probably don't want to spend all that time rewriting pages that are already working as they are. This is a good time, though, to do a little bit of gardening. And what I mean by that is you can kind of pull some weeds while you're in there. You don't want to repot the entire plant or resow the entire field, but some of these kind of easy to uproot weeds, naming conventions, directory structures, and additional linting rules, these are things that can be done with a little bit of effort, but will save you a ton of that sort of organizational pain in the long run, right? Can you unify snake case versus camel case, right? Can you also even, further from that, do you refer to the same concepts with the same variable names? This is where it gets really tricky, right? At Shipt, we do a lot of orders. We might be talking about the same thing on an order on different services, but it's called different things, right? So one of the struggles that we had was when we pulled all this together was we had variables that would reference the same thing conceptually, but maybe they had different names. So then you go back in thinking, I'm going to update this this concept across our application, and then you find out that you missed like 3 pages, and then people start slacking you, like, where's my thing? And you start panicking, and yeah, we've all been there. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. A little bit about our friend React here. These are some things that we've discovered. It's kind of like whack-a-mole, very similar to the naming conventions. Once you get in there and you start bringing these things in together, JavaScript hates timestamps, dates, and money, right? It hates these things. They can be very difficult to manage. Part of the problem is that rounding and using decimals in JavaScript is just prone to error, and the date object, which I hear is like changing, is a little bit dated. So the best way to manage this is to, once again, consolidation. Can you pull together whatever library or whatever utility functions you're using to manage these things into one place? When we first migrated, we had like 4 separate utility directories alone, and a lot of them all dealt with the same stuff. We had some microservices that were using Moment, which if you know JavaScript, rest in peace Moment. Some were using datefns, and some were just handling them with just plain JavaScript, which was crazy. But finding ways to pull these things together and consolidate them into one spot. So once again, when you go through and you start updating this monolith, you're not having to reach through and pull all this code in separate places and spend a lot of time repeating yourself. Another thing is nullish coalescing versus OR operating. And what I mean by this is if you use the double question mark instead of the double bar, as some of you may know from the syntax, it just helps you kind of play more into the principles of strict typing and helps you preserve meaningful but perhaps falsy values. One thing that we've noticed is there were some services, there were some front-end teams that would, instead of passing an empty array, maybe they pass array length is 0, right? And the OR operator and nullish coalescing, they have different values when you return those. And the other side of things is if you're moving from something that does not React, maybe you're moving from, I don't know, like I think Svelte or like PHP, Rails, whatever. A lot of those are going to be SSR, right? You're going to have server-side rendering. React, you're not going to get that out of the box. So just something to consider if you are going to bring this monolith together. If you're bringing in services or modules that do need SSR, you're going to have to build with Vite or Next or Remix, Express. There's tons of tools out there that do it. It's just something you have to remember. All right, so now you've written all your code, you've handled all your snags, you're now ready to do a release. There are no wrong ways to do a release, hypothetically, but there are less stressful ways, right? As long as you're careful, that's what's really important, hypothetically. So what you really want to do is, as you move through this, you want to avoid the big bang release, right? Because if you're dealing with a monolith and you're going for a big bang release, what you're looking at is a huge chunk of code that's just getting ejected into production at perhaps really long intervals. And what that means to me is you have a lot of code that may be production ready but isn't being used, which is sort of a loss of value. So if you can, prioritize your feature flags, launch Darkly, Optimizely, Flagsmith, all of these external providers, right? This is something that's relatively easy to integrate into your application. The downside of this, right, is that you kind of run into this problem, which we still struggle with today, is that you get a ton of stale feature flags potentially, or you're not quite sure about what the status of a flag might be at any point in time. So as our pro tip for releases and feature flags, if you can build a table with a little bit of glance value, this will help other engineers and users get a quick update on when the last time a flag was turned on or used, updated, right? When was the last time this segment was changed? So that way they know how much traffic has been gated into that feature flag, or ungated, depending on how you look at it. So as you can see, what we've done is red, yellow, green, depending on the level of activity. If when I see this red one here, I'm like, okay, this is something that we can either remove from the code entirely or turn off, or maybe this feature flag actually needs to be a permission because it's been living in the code for a really long time. All right, so to wrap it all up, to pull it all back together, we kind of started with our microservices. We talked about monoliths. We've talked about how to go in between. And I think what I really want to emphasize is what Donald Knuth said here, which is premature optimization is the root of all evil. And what he meant by this was not don't ever look to the future, don't ever try to make things better, but knowing when it's time, right? Timing is everything. Knowing when it's time, knowing what to move to, right? Making sure you're chasing problems, not trends. That's what's really important, and that's what's going to give you a much higher successful outcome than if you were to just, jump on the trend or go back to Bama Bangs or something crazy like that. But thank you all very much for the time. I appreciate it. Anybody have any questions? Sure.
When you're referring to microservices, are you referring to micro front ends when we talk about the front end?
Yeah, mostly micro front ends, yeah.
Yeah, and the other question I have is, like, we're facing like a similar decision in my company, and have you considered doing like not a monolith but a monorepo with multiple projects and libraries and separate deployments? And if you considered that and decided to go with monolith, what was the reasoning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we actually want to move that direction in the long run, is move towards monorepo. And for those of y'all that are not familiar with monorepo, I hope I summed this up correctly, but that's more of a strategy very similar to a monolith, but you have one repository and maybe you have multiple services or applications within one repository. So it's another pattern. And yeah, I think that's ideally for us where we want to end up. Like I said, we went from 40 microservice micro front ends down to 4 like modular monoliths. But I think what we want to move towards in the long run is that one repo and then using something like NX to really target deployments and releases. But that would also help us remove overhead. Because, efficiency is everything, right? I want to do one, update to my dependencies in one repo and be done with it. So it will hopefully help us like stop repeating ourselves on that maintenance effort. Yeah.
This all seems great. When are you going back?
Yeah.
I mean,
To-
like,
to
I
the
don't,
Gamma Bangs,
I don't
or-
mean to, I don't mean to be like trite about it or anything, but people, like the reason that people have a tendency to switch architectures is not because there's an objectively better architecture, but because the grass looks greener until they get across the bench, right? And then you're going to be gone one day, and the people who are working with you are going to be gone one day, and they're going to be like, we all think this new architecture is going to be the right answer. Do you feel like that's a thing that happened to you as well, or was it very, very intentional? Did you have you had like very crisp, like we had this problem was stupid, I don't want that problem, I want this new problem.
Yeah.
Or do you feel like you said, this sucks and I'd like it to suck less? Because that seems to be the two ways that people make that transition.
Yeah. So the first time we moved, right, I kind of came in right after we kicked that off. That's when I started at Shipt. And that was that moving off of Rails into React, right? We had decided like, hey, we're going to move all of our backends to Go. We're going to get the performance benefits of Go, right? We're going to adopt contemporary languages and things like that. And so as we moved through that, it took a really long time. We did a lot of innovation. And we kind of, like I said, erroneously we thought to ourselves, we're going to mirror the structure of our backend teams and build these micro front ends to try to make it like one vertical. And then one team will own both the backend and the front end. And so as we were doing that migration, we kind of decided like, you know what, maybe full stack teams aren't the way to go. And so one of the things you talk about like, this kind of sucks. Maybe do we have a metric or something here? One of the things that happened to us was we had kind of put all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, on a Create React App branch or fork, and we got stuck with an impending, I guess you could just say it was like a versioning dead end. So we knew we were going to have to migrate to something regardless. And then at that point in time, what we looked at was like organizationally, instead of having like a dedicated front-end platform team that just owns, like we build the architecture, other teams build the features, we move towards like this is going to be a platform and feature-based front-end team, and that was more in line with what Monolith would be beneficial for.
So you business drove this as well, right? Like
Yeah.
That's more of a business organizational decision than
Yeah,
an
yeah,
architectural decision.
yeah,
I mean, those two things are not materially different from each other. You just decide on when you go with them.
yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Appreciate y'all.